The thing in the news this week is the fudge on Mars. And already we've had thousands, if not millions, of people contacting us to talk about the possibility of fudge on Mars.
Really?
Was it millions? Was it?
I'm really
millions?
impressed.
Was it one person? No, I don't think we heard anybody. But this is the fudge on Mars, and we do want to hear from you. And today we're going to be looking at something which I find absolutely fascinating. It's to do with a way of thinking which is not very Western, but it's more Eastern and particularly Hebraic. And that's the idea of thinking, which is that things are not either or, but they're both and. So I'm going to kick off with asking Steve or David, who are the usual contributors to the podcast, what they think about this. Steve?
Well, you've used the word Hebraic, which would immediately get people turning off this podcast. It's a word that is very provocative for some, but I think it's a word that needs to be redefined. So what is Hebraic? What are we actually talking about? Well, do you want the long answer or the short answer?
Well, as we don't know what we're talking about, we'll have the long answer.
Well, let me take you back. So as a writer, I was writing books about 20 years ago on certain subjects, mainly Israel, Jewish people, Jesus, things like that. Then I got approached by someone who was, now this might sound very immodest to me, but probably the major Bible teacher of the day, Mr. David Pawson, who I'm sure you've both heard of, and a lot of people would have heard of. He's died now. He died a few years ago. But at that time, he was the number one Bible, sort of solid, fundamental, conservative, let's say, Bible teacher in this country. And he was a writer. And this was one of his subjects. He did a audio tape, which I listened to when I was in Israel, funnily enough, walking along the street in Jerusalem. First time I ever heard of this subject came from a tape done by David Pawson. And what it was doing, it was looking at the Greek influences on humanity and on the church, but in general, the way that we think, the way that the Greek mindset has dominated our Western thinking right from the beginning. He didn't say any more than that, but he sort of opened up the idea that there are other ways of thinking, and this is what the subject, I think, of what we're talking about is the other way of thinking. So it's thinking differently.
Can I just ask you one question there? How come that the Greeks seem to have such an influence upon Western thinking?
It's a bit of a question, isn't it? I mean, are we historians? Do we understand social anthropology or some such long words to describe the ebb and flows of civilizations? I mean, are we actually qualified?
I think what he's saying, David, he hasn't got a clue.
I know why the Greeks suddenly appeared at that moment in time. You know, it's something that people write PhD theses about a bit.
But what we're talking about is that there were famous philosophers, people like Plato and Aristotle and Pluto and Mickey Mouse, all of whom had a massive influence on our thinking.
Basically, they all appeared
through the ages.
Before Jesus. It was during, let's say, in Bible times, it's during the time of the Old Testament, was when probably the 5th century BC or something like that. Suddenly, out of the blue, there's a massive explosion in Athens, of all places, of these intellects. Just, I suppose, you started off with one or two, and then their ideas sort of expanded and other people got attracted in. Who's to know, were they especially clever in those days? I don't know, but certainly most of our life today, in terms of the way that we think with our rational mind, actually goes back to that short period of time. It's something that people, just ponder over, and I don't think we're ever going to come into any answers. Simply to say that something happened in Athens in maybe the 5th century BC with people like Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, that basically created the bedrock and the foundations for the whole of Western civilization. So how about that then? That's a good start. So now David Jones will then expand on that statement, no doubt.
Well, I think there was a tendency for people at that time to believe in myth and superstition, much as we see in our own day as well. And I guess these philosophers tried to be more rational in their thinking. Just to put a caveat in there, though, there were some of the philosophical ideas of Plato which almost seemed to break from his main narrative. And for those who don't know, it take ages to go into this now, but one of Plato's main teaching is to do with the shadows in the cave. And basically, somebody comes to enlightenment when he leaves the cave and he sees the world the way it is. And you can twist that both ways, really. You can see that as his moment of, so this is what the world is about. Almost the way that Richard Dawkins would write today. He talks about the magic of reality, which is the title of one of his books, which are actually aimed at teenagers. That God cannot possibly exist because it goes against all logic and all rationale. Whereas the Hebraic mindset, I guess, would say, hold on, you're relying on your own wisdom to try and work out the way the world is, and maybe there's something beyond man's wisdom.
Yeah, it's interesting that Plato, he did believe in another world. He did believe in a God figure, but it's not the God that we believe. It's not a personal God. It's very much an impersonal God. An idea. It's like the Force, Star Wars Force, that type of thing, and that's really the bedrock of his beliefs. And as David said, the theory of forms, which was the cave and all that, actually divided the world into the physical and spiritual. And for him, the only part of the world that was important was the spiritual. Everything physical was very much inferior to the spiritual. And out of that came all sorts of nonsense and stuff that got into Christianity and perverted Christianity in major ways. Because going back to the way we talked about Hebraic way of looking at it, which is a contrast to that, is to say the world should be looked at as a complete whole, as a holistic whole with the physical and the spiritual working together. But the Greeks divided the two up, and that's has caused a lot of problems in a lot of ways. And I don't know how far you want to go into that.
Well, I'm interested really in seeing what we're talking about before we start to look at the Hebraic side of things, because it gives us a setting for why Hebraic thinking is so different. And there was a word that you mentioned, David, which I know I'm taking a little bit out of context from what you were saying, but you mentioned the word enlightenment. And of course, there was an enlightenment in, what was it, the 16th, 17th century, something like that?
Yeah.
What was that all about? I mean, that actually also was something to do with moving away from religious ways of looking things, wasn't it, in particular?
It was a process that had started back in medieval times when the Christian church had, let's say, philosophers like Thomas Aquinas, for instance, who started telling people, up to now, you have operated totally on faith, believing in this God, the God of the Bible, and we need faith to understand it. And he basically gave an idea that he got from one of the Greek philosophers, Aristotle, to say, reason has to be in there as well. You can't have faith without reason. And what he did, he created a process by having reason coming into the equation as well as this faith in God that basically led Western civilization up to the Enlightenment, where, as David, as you hinted, superstitions had got in the way and the church was going steadily downhill with superstitions and all sorts of nonsense that came into the church. And people said, come on, enough is enough. If we can't rely on the church anymore, we can only rely on ourselves, our own humanistic understanding. And so the Enlightenment is like bringing light into things, not the light that we, so, it's amazing. It's a word that should have been a Christian word, isn't it? The light comes in, the light of the gospel shines in. It's the total opposite. It's the light of the Greek philosophers coming back and steering people on a path of humanism, of man-centered religion,
Yeah. So let me ask you another question. Is this rational thinking, this looking towards reason for answers to things, is it something that we should completely dismiss? Or is it something that we should be saying, well, actually, there's a lot of value in this as well?
I think we have to tread really carefully. I don't think we can throw the baby out with the bathwater here, because there is logic. Yeah. If you look at things like mathematics and the link between mathematics and music, so many people who are fantastic musicians are also fantastic mathematicians. So there seems to be a way of looking at the universe in which it is very ordered. And therefore, are we looking there at complete, cold, clinical rationalism, or are we looking at the mind of God? Or can we have both? I think it's very interesting what Steve was saying about the Age of Enlightenment, because obviously 100 years later, we get Charles Darwin publishing his theory of evolution in 1859. And that book obviously did great damage to the way that people had viewed the church. It was not quite the final nail in the coffin, although that's what it felt like to a lot of people. Yep. And it's interesting that then brilliant writers like H.G. Wells pick up on this later on. And I think this is really, I don't know whether we want to go down this road tonight, but I think it's really interesting for people to perhaps explore is why was H.G. Wells so pleased about Darwin's theory? And the answer to that seems to be was it gave him an excuse for sin. Because he thought, if there is no God, then I can lead a completely hedonistic lifestyle, which of course then goes back to the ancient Greeks as well.
Yeah. And that is the refuge of atheism, is if, and this is why people like Richard Dawkins, and who are on the decline now, supposedly, would say, okay, if there's no God, then there is no absolute standards of morality, and you're free to do what you like. And it becomes a religion in itself. A religion of no God is still a religion. It's still a faith that there is no God, and there are no standards of morality, and you're free to do anything you like. And out of that comes absolute madness, because if there are no standards of morality, if the 10 Commandments are not relevant, then you get basically the situation we have now in our culture of relativism, and no one knows what's right and what's wrong anymore. And that goes right back to the Enlightenment, that type of thinking. Even in the church at the beginning of the 20th century, you had these liberal tendencies coming into the church, which came out of Darwinism and stuff that was coming out of Germany, where they were deconstructing the faith and stripping out anything that seemed unbelievable. In other words, the miracles. They took the miracles out and they produced gospels that had just the teachings of Jesus, basically, and anything that didn't smack of a supernatural God. And that was an uncomfortable faith for them.
Really? I didn't know that, or maybe I didn't read that bit in one of your books.
Yeah, I think I read it somewhere in one of my books.
I mean, it sounds to me like there is a sense where reason is critical. I mean, if I drive at 120 miles an hour in my car into a brick wall, there will be unfathomable damage to me. That's no question. It's logic. And so there's a lot of logic in the universe, isn't there? Which we can't just ignore. But what we seem to be saying, and where we need to be going, is that maybe there's a different way of looking at a lot of things.
What it is balance. It's getting the balance. And what has happened with a lot of people sucked into atheism, and particularly science, they say, we can't believe in religion because we believe in science, as if the two are mutually exclusive. But God created science. Science is a mechanism that that ensured that the universe works and that we are able to function as human beings. There's nothing incompatible between God and science. A lot of as David Jones will no doubt tell us, a lot of the early scientists were all Christians. Of sort. I mean, I'm not sure Newton, whether he was that orthodox, but certainly a lot, if not, most scientists were Christians, because they could see that science was a mechanism that God used. And so, we have to get the balance. And this is the problem. The balance has gone the other way. In fact, I would say it's gone differently. I would say back at the beginning of the 20th century, when we had the new atheists, the four men that everyone revered as these fantastic atheists that had the answers to everything. That age is now gone. So even the age of rationalism is now gone. So we're talking about a totally different cultural climate now, where people don't believe and don't think. So they haven't got either. Whereas, the ideal thing is that our brains, our rational minds, are important as well as our faith. Because in Isaiah it says, "Come, let us reason together." There's nothing wrong with reasoning, but not at the expense of faith in the living God.
How has this rational thinking affected the church in its theology?
Well, it's knackered, isn't it?
It's what? Is that a technical term?
Yes, it's ancient Greek.
Oh, it's ancient Greek. All right.
It's a Hebraism. It's to be knackered,
Would you explain, one of you?
Well, yeah. I think what we mentioned perhaps a few weeks ago on one of the podcasts was the story of the former Bishop of Durham, David Jenkins, and he took this to, I guess, in inverted commas, its logical conclusion, which was that Jesus could not possibly have risen from the dead because that's irrational.
Yeah,
it's no different than what Dawkins says. So what we get here is, I think there is a way of squaring the circle here, David. But what we start off with is we start off with our own presuppositions. So Dawkins and his ilk, their presupposition is God doesn't exist, therefore miracles are not possible. Therefore Jesus can't walk on water, and he can't feed 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish, nor can he come out of a tomb after lying there for 3 days.
It's not logical. It's not logical.
Absolutely. So then if you flip that, and if your presupposition is God exists, therefore miracles are possible. Therefore Jesus can walk on water, he can do a miracle of multiplication, and he can come out of the tomb after 3 days. But as I said, I think there is a way of squaring the circle, and I think even some of the more militant atheists are now starting to row back from their positions because they're realizing that there is a real danger to it. So Richard Dawkins is one of the most outspoken critics of this gender identity movement because he knows that biology completely disproves it. Every cell in your body will declare whether you're male or female. Professor Robert Winston, the guy who's done an awful lot of work on fertility treatment for women, who happens to be Jewish, he also has said some things. In fact, there's a clip, I definitely recommend people to watch it. He was on Question Time talking about it. And when he was interviewed, I think it was Fiona Bruce who was doing it then. I could be wrong about that. And they said, "Listen, we're going to come to you now, Professor Winston, because of your role as I don't know whether he was like the principal or he had a major role in the university anyway." And he said, "Well, I actually thought you would have come to me because I'm a biologist." And there was like a deathly silence from the audience because they knew what he was about to say, that actually biology completely disproves this idea that you can be, lots and lots of different agendas. And of course, the crude, and I do mean that, the crude outcome of all this is that then therefore people can just declare that they identify as a cat or wherever it might be. So people are rolling back from it. They're realizing, actually, hold on a minute. In the Bible, it does say in the beginning, God created them male and female. So actually, you therefore say, well, hold on, maybe there is something to this Hebraic stuff. Maybe we shouldn't just dismiss it out of hand.
Yeah, I can give you a basic definition of the difference between Hebraic and Greek in terms of certainly any Christians or anyone with an open mind, let's say, that's willing to accept that there may be some truth in the Bible and who may have some understanding of the very, very first part of the Bible, which is the creation of man. So let's assume it's true. Okay, so hold on to your beliefs and just accept the fact that we believe it if you don't. So, and we believe that Adam was created. God created Adam, and Eve was created out of Adam. So, how did they live? They lived a life where they were given this garden to live in and to look after, and they had work to do. They walked with God. God walked with them in the the corners of the night. They were naming the animals. They were tilling the garden. They had a relationship with God. This is the thing. So they had a relationship. God was a very clear presence in their life. That, what I would call a totally Hebraic existence of God being so present in your life that you never doubt it because he's there. And of course, in their case, we expect that they actually saw him or felt him in a way that we don't anymore. And the reason why we don't is what happened next, because we saw the devil entering the scene, and we have this thing called the fall, where they ate of the forbidden fruit. So what happens when they eat of the forbidden fruit, despite the fact that God said don't eat it? They disobeyed him, and they disobeyed him by following their own will. They listened to the devil, and they decided to eat the fruit. And the consequences of that is that suddenly they had this wisdom. They had this quest for knowledge. They immediately knew they were naked, and so they clothed themselves. They also knew that they had crossed the Rubicon, in a sense, and ruined their relationship with God. They no longer could walk with God. God had to eject them from the garden. So in a sense, they now had a thoroughly Greek mindset. They went from the Hebraic mindset, where they walked with God, they had a relationship with God, to a mindset where everything was about themselves and their need for wisdom. And that's the main difference. So you can go right back to the beginning, even before there were such things as Greek people, and they're the two differences, having God at the center or yourself at the center. And that is really the main way of understanding Greek versus Hebrew.
Oh, that's interesting. That's a good way of putting it, Steve. My little Greek mind was going, how could they have crossed the Rubicon before the Romans?
Okay. I mean, haven't you heard of popular sayings?
I tell you why I wanted us to look at this subject tonight. I'm currently narrating an audiobook for a friend of Steve's and mine. I haven't seen him for many years, a guy called David Evans, who is sadly quite ill, as I understand it. And he wrote a book which was called, Steve, remind me what it's called, can you?
It had a blue cover, that's all I remember.
I should know, because it's called Christians in Israel, right. The Heart of the Matter, a concise guide. And I was intrigued when I got to chapter 1, which talked about the either-or mentality of the church. I was just going to read you a little bit from it, and it struck me particularly one aspect straight away. David says, Christians often seem to feel they must choose between two seeming opposites on a point of doctrine rather than embrace both aspects. I can understand it. Sometimes the opposite sides of the argument seem contradictory and irreconcilable. I struggled with that word irreconcilable when I was doing the narration. I would give some examples of this tendency to polarize and then explain the relevance of the point of the book. Law or grace? Is the Old Testament all law and the New Testament all grace, or is there some of each in both testaments? And the next one was the one that really got me, was predestination or free will. Did God choose us, or did we choose him? Was it both? Now, that fundamental theological point is a major point of division within the church, isn't it?
Yeah.
Predestination or free will.
Yeah.
If you kind of look at the reform theology, I mean, perhaps you could explain that a little bit more, Steve, because you probably know more about it than I do.
Well, again, okay, Greek thinking. So going back to the Adam and Eve thing, so suddenly their own brains, their own rational mind was the center of the universe. Okay, so the way that the Greeks thought was basically making a god out of their own mind. And one aspect of that is that everything had to be, things like deductive logic came out of that, sort of logical ways of doing stuff. And out of that came the realization in their sort of narrow way of looking at the world that there can only be one way of looking at things. You can't either something is black or it's white. If you can be right, which means everyone else is wrong. And out of that, this is where you get doctrines like the Calvinists will say, everyone is predestined, and the Arminians will say there's free will. And each of them, and we all know people who Christians who take one side or the other, they won't budge, and they won't they would fall out of fellowship with each other because of this point of doctrine, and this is the either or thing, where if I'm right, you're wrong, and that is Greek thing. Hebraic thinking is the other thing. It's both and, which basically says there are ways we can look at both. We can, there's a sense where God chose us, but we also had to choose as well. Can't we accept that both? And the Greek mind can't take that. The Greek mind has to be very logical. That's, there's only one way of looking at things. But the Hebraic mind is very understanding and very, I'm trying to think of the word, sort of open to possibilities, to patterns and differences, and let's discuss things. Let's have a meeting of minds and see each other's point of view.
So you could be right, and I could be right, and somewhere in the middle, maybe that's where the answer is.
Yeah, and even if we don't get the answer, who cares? We're still friends, aren't we?
I mean, that's very much the way that discussions took place in Jewish yeshivas, didn't they?
Yeah, and still do. They say, get 2 Jews, you get 3 opinions. and then that's not necessarily a problem. And sometimes, and what God actually wants, for those who believe in God, is that He likes to see people discussing. He doesn't like to see people arguing. And the whole church and Western society has been about arguing. Look at today, our society at the moment. How many people are understanding each other? They're not. It's so Greek, it's unbelievable.
Well, that was what struck me as I read this, that it had affected the church fundamentally, but it's also affected society. So that we see this polarization. There was a nice little thing when I was doing a bit of research where I came across a story by a Jewish guy, and he was saying that when he was a young lad, his aunt, who he loved very much, came up to him and she said, who do you think loves you most? Your mama or your papa? And he didn't know how to answer. And it was a really, he suddenly said, why do I have to choose one or the other? It's both. And, we've got this polarization in society. Let's think about this in terms of what's happening in Israel and Gaza. Who does God love most? The Palestinians or Israel?
God loves everyone.
Well, there you go.
God wants there to be peace. It's we that create the divisions, or let's say the enemy of our soul encourages us to find divisions and find reasons to hate each other. Hate doesn't come from God.
And yet what we do is we've seen on the streets, and we've talked about this before, haven't we? These protests where it's totally polarized. You're either for one side or you're for the other, but you don't accept that the other side has any point of view.
No, and this is why I don't get politics, and David will argue with this. You have to be conservative or Labour, and you have to vote for this or vote for that. A Hebraic thing will say, I like this bit of the Tories, I like this bit of the Labour. Isn't there a way I can sort of vote for both of them in a sense, so that I can have my own individual political expression rather than having to toe the party line?
Well, I think, Steve, that I 100% agree with that. I mean, we've had the comment today, haven't we, by Keir Starmer, that he's thinking about banning smoking, not just in public places, but actually outside in pub gardens and all those kind of areas. And I would actually subscribe to that view.
Just give a round of applause for that, shall we?
Absolutely. I mean, as a non-smoker myself and someone who grew up in a household where both my mum and dad smoked, I can't stand nicotine. So I also think we should do everything to protect children. And just to show you how ridiculous this can be, I better be careful what I say here because I've got to protect people. But Joe's had people, my wife Jo, who's a gastroenterologist, but she's had people who've come into her to see her in clinic who have irreparably damaged their liver due to alcoholism. Now, you can't have, from what I understand, I could get this bit wrong, but my understanding is you can't be given a liver transplant until you have at least had, I think it's 12 months. I might have the timescale wrong. 12 months without a drop of alcohol. something like that. Again, I'd say I could be wrong about that, about the timing of it. And Joe has seen plenty of people in clinic who just cannot do that. So they die because they won't give up the drink. And, the ramifications and the repercussions of that, not just for themselves, for that individual, but for their families as well. So actually, sometimes I think the government has to do things to protect us from ourselves. So I haven't got an issue with that. But the flip side of it would be that then, before the general elections at some point last year, Angela Rayner had actually turned around and said that, all Tories were scum. Well, again, that's ridiculous as well. So, we've got to meet in the middle somewhere. We've got to be able to applaud the other side when they do something right. And again, David, just one final thing on this, which, maybe we can come on to. But one of the things that I think St. Augustine mentioned was that, he felt it was always absolutely wrong to tell a lie. And I would say that's moronic thinking. That's absolutely moronic thinking. But for the simple reason that if you look at the Holocaust, if I was brave enough to have hidden Jews in my home and there was a knock on the door, would I have told the Nazis that I was hiding Jews there? Absolutely not. And I would have felt that I was actually acting righteously. Whereas some people, St. Augustine would have said, oh, no, you weren't, because you were telling a lie.
Yeah.
That brings us to a whole other area of what is the greater good.
Yeah.
Which maybe could be a thing we could look at another time in the future.
And that just shows you how Christian theology can get in the way of practical living. As well. And the Jewish idea that, that preserving life is just so important that you can forget about our man-made rules of the Sabbath and such. That's why it's permitted to save a life on the Sabbath. Whereas, other religious systems will not allow that. And again, that's Hebraic. That is saying there's more to life than sticking to your rules. Preserving life, it has to be the ultimate important thing. And, everything else has to go out the window. And that is Hebraic. And that is, again, more examples of Hebraic versus the Greek thinking that's the bedrock of our culture.
And I think, Steve, to go back to what you were saying about, this whole argument between Calvinists and Arminians about free will and predestination, I'm going to be really honest, guys. I don't give a stuff. I mean, it's not an issue that I can even be bothered about. Did God choose me or did I choose him? Who cares? The fact, what does it matter?
There's got to be a book there somewhere which is called "I Don't Care a Stuff."
Absolutely.
Who cares?
And the reason is that people are too clever for their own good. They like the idea of, writing books and becoming fated and going on conference tours and whatever because of their cleverness. At the end of the day, they're not clever at all. They're just opinionated, and because of their opinions, they'll be making enemies and doing everything that God doesn't want us to do, basically.
Well, you get this in so many different ways within the church, don't you? You've got the premillennialist view and the amillennialist view and the post-pre-tribulation and all this stuff,
Oh, I know.
Going back to the politics thing, I found what you said interesting because I watched Sir Keir Starmer giving that address in the garden at Number 10 the other day.
Did you stay awake?
I actually thought... Thank you. I actually thought quite a lot of what he said, I thought, that's quite reasonable. Yeah, I get what he's saying. Yeah, I understand that. And for my sins, I do watch GBN News quite a bit, and I quite like GBN News because they are very much about wanting freedom of speech, but they are at times a little bit too right-wing. And when we
right wing, what does that even mean these days?
Yeah, well, I can't remember his name, so I'm going to say his name is Andrew, and I think he writes for the Daily Mail.
Pierce.
I know what you mean. Yeah.
Andrew Pierce.
Andrew Pierce, that's the guy. And they switch back to the studio. Andrew Pierce, basically, what a load of rubbish. Everything he said was negative because he's coming from a certain point of view, and he hadn't got a single good word to say for Sir Keir Starmer.
Mm.
They then got two guys in. One was a top guy in the Tory party, and the other guy was a Labour guy. The Labour guy, positive about Sir Keir Starmer. The Tory guy, negative. And I agree with Steve.
It's
pathetic. Why can't it's pathetic? I mean, why can't we, get on in Parliament, in the House of Commons, where these guys go? Actually, you've just made a really good point. That was well done. Well done. I agree with that.
Yeah.
I wonder if we could just explore that a little bit more.
No, the thing is,
what a load of rubbish!
As soon as they get into power, that they have to toe the party line, even if they don't believe it.
Yes,
and that's why
true.
You've got to be such an accomplished liar to be a politician, unfortunately, because if you don't toe the party line, then the whip will get you, and you'll be out. And
but we do have this either or view, don't we, about so many things?
Yeah, and that is like a microcosm of our society, is what happens in Parliament, is total polarisation. Can you think of anyone, maybe David Jones can, because he's into politics, anyone who would actually concede a point to the other side?
I don't know about.
Have you ever seen?
Yeah, I don't know about conceding a point. I think it may have been Channel 4 a number of years ago that did this lovely piece about this friendship between two politicians at either end of the spectrum. And it was Jacob Rees-Mogg and Jess Phillips. I'm sure a lot of people will know those names, but just
she's from Birmingham, isn't she?
Yeah, so I think it's a Selly-Oak or somewhere that she's from, and obviously Jacob Rees-Mogg, who always speaks with a plum in his mouth, and yet they were great friends, really great friends, and they could respect one another. And why could they do that? Because they were decent human beings. That's all this is about. And you can concede a point. You can say, yeah, that's really good. I'll be honest, David. I was probably texting Andrew Pearce as he was on, because I found Starmer's speech on Tuesday absolutely dreadful. But I thought what he said today was actually very good. So, and I would concede that point. What I didn't like about Tuesday was I didn't think there was any hope that he was offering for people.
But that's because you're not a politician, you see. So maybe you have free will to make opinions without looking over your shoulder whether someone's approving or disapproving of you. And that's what the world, if the world was Hebraic, it will be like you, David. It will be assessing every situation on its merits and not just saying what you're meant to be saying to keep your party leader happy.
So you were texting Andrew Pearce. What were you saying?
I was just saying, isn't this awful? Don't you just want to fall asleep? Is he going to say? Is he going to say anything positive at all?
Stop now. We're not doing this podcast anymore. Andrew Pearce and David Jones are in bed together.
On?
No, we will not say that.
Yeah, you might want to roll back away from that, because Andrew Pearce is actually gay. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I just want to say hello to Andrew. I'll see you next time. But yeah, it's so churlish, isn't it? That's what it boils down to. It's just ridiculously churlish. Instead of just saying, it's the same with the Armenians and the Calvinists. Instead, just well, we could be right, but you could be right. I think the danger is that there are certain fundamentals that we cannot allow to be diluted or watered down, and that's where we have to be careful. And that's why I think I was greatly upset all those years ago when David Jenkins said what he said about there being no physical resurrection, because I think that's like basic Christianity. If you deny that, you're going to deny everything else.
But if you knew his background, he was an academic.
Yeah,
he was very much on the liberal wing, and he even denied the virgin birth.
Yeah,
but it even came across in his attitude and his personal behaviour. He was fond of swearing. I think I heard him swearing in the pulpit apparently. And, it gets to the point where you may be saying the stuff, but you're not doing the stuff. And that is a major difference between Greek and Hebrew. He would be a perfect Greek Christian. He knows the stuff. He's got his own views. He may be right, may be wrong. He doesn't care. He thinks he's right. But if the love of God doesn't flow through your works or through the way that you do stuff, then you're not a Christian. A Greek Christian is not a Christian.
Yeah.
A Christian is someone that follows the word, not just spouting it. It might be someone that would win every Bible quiz known to man, but would never go and do the washing up. And that's a very sort of simplistic way, but that's how it is. And throughout Christendom, there's been Greek Christians.
Got a dishwasher, Steve.
Or dishwasher. Yeah. Let the electricity do the job.
That's a good point, really, because there's something about the heart and the integrity of the person that's important when you're looking at points of view. But I would love there to be a way forward in society where we move forward with collaboration rather than confrontation.
Yeah, and you probably get it in society in some people who are very altruistic, not necessarily Christians, but I think of my son who's not a believer. He was taking in refugees into his house at some point. He works for charities. But he doesn't have the love of God in his heart, but he does it.
Right.
So I would say he's thoroughly Hebraic in his attitude, even though he doesn't have God at the center, because he has his beliefs.
Would he be somebody who's Jesus would say to him, "You're not far from the kingdom of God"?
I suppose so, and and that could be a controversial thing to say because, but he's not a Christian. He's not a Christian.
Yeah,
God's not interested. God's not interested in him. And the people saying that, you doubt whether they're believers themselves, because as I say, if it doesn't flow, if you don't have the fruits of the Spirit, it means God isn't in you, and if God isn't in you, then you can have no claim of being a Christian. You might believe the stuff or think you believe in it, but if it doesn't affect you, then God is not working within you, and you're not one of the gang.
I remember somebody once said that some people will be very surprised when they get to heaven, and they see who else is there.
Yeah. I know, and who's not there.
Because they don't fit in with their belief systems.
It goes back, that doesn't it, to the old joke when somebody arrives in heaven who happens to be from the Protestant persuasion, and he sees this whacking great big wall there, and he actually says, why is there a wall there, St. Peter? And Peter replies, the Catholics are over the other side, but they think they're the only ones here. It's that kind of.
I heard it was the brethren.
I heard it was both the Armenians and the Calvinists, and there was another wall to separate them over that wall.
But following, just thinking about Catholics and Protestants, go back to the time of the Tudors. Catholics and Protestants were killing each other, burning each other at the stake, decapitating each other, all because of their interpretation of the religion.
Yeah.
How is that a Christian thing? And
it just wasn't, was it?
Yeah, and we don't go that far, but it's not far off. In our case, it's words that we use and attitudes.
Yeah,
it's no different. They were totally Greek. They had their way of doing it. Everyone else was wrong, and because they're wrong, they're worthy of death, basically, and that's it.
So our approach should be: I disagree with you. However, I recognise that you have a very strong point of view. Can we sit down and talk about it?
Yeah,
Let's see if we can come to some understanding, because I don't get you at the moment. I would like to get you. And perhaps we'll find a new place to be together if we sit and chat about it.
Yeah.
Gosh, that's revolutionary, isn't it?
I'll never work. Wish you well with that one.
Yeah, well, welcome to Utopia.
Oh, well, that's it. That's the end of the world, isn't it?
But I think you're right, David. I think there are ways in which we can be conciliatory towards people and be kind. I think the thing I struggle with sometimes is that the people who often have on their social media platforms those two words, be kind, can often be some of the most cruel and belligerent and bellicose people imaginable. And you think, well, hold on, it says on your profile, be kind.
But that was Google, wasn't it? Their motto was don't be evil or something like that.
Right.
When it first started, look what's happened to them,
Yeah, it's just strange. And, I mean, I know people will immediately make certain assumptions about myself because I've supported the Conservative Party since about 1992. regardless of who's been leading it.
Heretic.
Heretic. Terrible things. But I just think, well, that's just, you don't know me. Get to know me. Get to know me, because my political persuasion is just a very, very small part of who I am. And my attitude has always been, look, there's certain things in my life that I could be dead wrong about. I could be dead wrong about politics. I'm definitely dead wrong about the football team I support, Everton. But I believe I'm right about Jesus.
Yeah.
I don't think I've got that bit wrong.
Yeah.
But I'm willing to chat about it, even if you feel differently.
And the other thing is to open up the possibility of being changed, of changing your mind and being open to change. Obviously not on your beliefs, on your basic beliefs, but certainly on the way that you look at the world. We have to be open to the fact we've got to be teachable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We can't be pedantic, about everything. And again, that's a feature of our world. And we see it with all the hatred and all the misunderstandings we see in our culture. So there.
So there is a danger that we could be wrong.
Yeah.
Possibly.
Even though we're convinced we're right.
Certainly in your case, yeah.
Well, I'm speaking as somebody who supports Liverpool, and so far we haven't lost a match.
You're
this
playing
season.
the mighty West Ham in the League Cup, so watch it.
Yeah. Have they won a match this season yet?
Yeah, 2.
What about Everton?
Well, we beat Doncaster Rovers for the second season running in the League Cup, so there we go.
That's the pinnacle of their success.
But you see it in football, don't you? That if you're an Arsenal supporter, you cannot have any support for, is it Chelsea?
Tottenham,
that's it.
Yeah.
And I suppose it's the same with Everton and Liverpool, isn't it?
I'm just so way past that, though. When I watch football, I just think I can admire great skill. I can admire. I mean, who scored for Liverpool their first goal the other day? It was such a brilliant goal. I can't remember who it was. Was it Diaz?
Salah,
I think it was Diaz.
Diaz.
Yeah.
It was Diaz. Yeah.
It was just a terrific goal. If you can't admire that, if you can't say what a fantastic goal, then again you're back into those entrenched positions.
Yeah,
that was a strange thing, wasn't there, with the World Cup, where I can't remember which World Cup it was, where England were in but Scotland weren't, and the Scots were saying, "Well, we're not going to support England.
No,
we're going to support. I don't know who they were supporting. Was it Germany or something?
I think that happened. That happened in the European Championship, wasn't it? They were supporting every team that we played against, except England. Yeah, it's with a passion.
Daft.
It's daft, isn't it? It really is daft.
Yeah.
Okay.
A lot of these things are historical, aren't they? They go back. They go back in history to Edward Longshanks and what he did to the hammer of the Scots and stuff, and so that's still deeply embedded. And again, a lot of that is just harmless. I mean, what do I care if the Scots want England to lose every time we play somebody else? It doesn't make any difference to me. And every time, if I'm watching Northern Ireland or the Republic of Ireland or Scotland or Wales, I'll always want them to beat the other team. But it doesn't make it. What does it matter at the end of the day?
No. Right.
But you're right about there being historical roots.
Of course there are.
Cause there to be partisan attitudes towards things.
Yeah.
I mean, you've really got to look at Northern Ireland for that, haven't you?
Well, yeah, that's a whole other can of worms.
With anything to do with religion, Israel and Palestine. I mean, just go back to Abraham. Just go back to Isaac and Ishmael if you want to.
Yes,
everything has a historical precedent.
I think it's great when somebody is confronted with both logic and the supernatural at the same time. And one of my favorite stories of teaching is I was teaching about the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, and doing it from a very logical point of view and trying to explain to the students that, one of the reasons Christians believe that Jesus rose from the dead is, what are the alternatives to what took place? The disciples come and steal the body. And then obviously being a Scouse, I made a joke about the fact that, Peter, James and John were not Scousers, so they probably didn't nick the body. And I went on to say about my own dad, when my dad died, Just imagine if myself and my two brothers had gone all around Merseyside telling people that I'd risen from the dead. And in fact, people were getting complaining about us because it'd become a real nuisance factor in the local community. And then in the end, the police turned around and said to us, look, if you don't stop saying this, lads, we're going to have you arrested and thrown into cells. And then at that point, we would have said, yeah, it's a fair cop. We've gone buried under the patio area. We'll just bring them out. And I made the point that actually the disciples never did that they were willing to go to their deaths for this.
Yeah.
And one young girl, never forgotten her, one young girl, this was a year 10 class, so we're talking 14, 15-year-olds. She suddenly blurted out from out of nowhere, said, I can't have this. I thought, this is an interesting reaction. I said, well, what do you mean? She said, no, I can't have this. And I said, why? Well, what's troubling you so much? She said, because if this is true, I'm going to have to change the whole of my life.
Yeah.
I thought, right, out of the mouth of babes and all that. So there you've got somebody realizing the logic of Jesus rising from the dead is the supernatural elements of that means that my life needs to be transformed.
Yeah.
And to quote somebody that we know very well, now everything changes after that particular point.
Absolutely. Who moved the stone?
And then we go along to the question of, is there fudge on Mars?
Absolutely.
It certainly is.
Guys, I think we've knocked this about quite a lot, really. Very interesting. I've learned a lot listening to you two, so thank you so much for your time. We leave it open to the people who've been listening, so do send us your thoughts on this. We would love to hear from you. Please put something on saltshakers.com where you can find a place to put comments and thoughts and questions and disagreements. We don't mind. Whatever you want to put, we'll listen to it. And Steve will respond because he's really good at that.
I thought you were doing that.
Yeah, I thought I was going to do that. I've not got access to it at the moment. Okay. So you need to give me access.
We should just explain to everybody that we do have a separate form for both Armenians and Calvinists as well.
Oh, you got them going now.
Yeah, you finished me off now with that.
Come on.
So from Mr. Maltzberger, Steve Maltz.
Goodbye.
And from Mr. Jones.
Goodbye, folks.
And from me. We'll catch you again next time. Bye for now.
Bye.